What's up, ladies and gentlemen? And today it's going to be another What's Flying Us Guys video. Even though I did make one just a few days ago, I just felt like making another one, so we're just going to get right in with here. You can see there's 3 aircraft in the London airspace. So we're going to get straight on with this one, which is a DHL Airbus A300. Which is heading over to Brussels, and it's departed. It's only just departed East Midlands about 15 minutes ago. Just in front of him, but above him, is a Ryanair 737-800, which is just arriving into London Stansted from Malaga. And over at Luton, we have another Ryanair 737-800, which just arrived into Luton from Varnelos. Next one we're going to see here is a FedEx 757-200, which has just departed East Midlands 10 minutes ago and is heading over to Liege. Next, we've got a Ukraine International Airlines 737-800, which has left London Gatwick for Kiev. Next, we have the world's largest passenger plane, the Airbus A380 Emirates, which is just departed London Heathrow and is heading over to Dubai. We're going to scrap this one. Next, we have a Thomas Cook in the in an ex-Aeroflot A321, and is heading over to Manchester from Pathos. Next, we have a Swift Air Embraer 120. Which has just departed London Stansted for Glasgow. Next, we have a TUI 737-800 with split scimitars and is heading over to East Midlands. Next, we have an ALS Airlines Hungary 737-400 which is only just departed East Midlands and is heading over to Paris Charles de Gaulle. Next, we have a Titan 737-400, which is making a flight to London Stansted from Belfast. Next, we have an EasyJet A320, which is making a flight over to Manchester from Prasavia. Next, we have another DHL A300 which is only just which I believe is just about to depart East Midlands and is heading over to Leipzig. Next, we have another EasyJet A320, and it's just arrived in to Liverpool from Lanzarote. Next, we have a Sunwings Airlines 737-8 and is making a flight over to Belfast from Rhodes. Next, we have a Jet2 737-300, which is making a flight from Newcastle to Leeds. Next, we have a Jet2 737-300, and it's making a flight to Newcastle from Zakynthos. Next, we have another Thomas Cook A321, which has just arrived to Newcastle from Fuerteventura. Next, we have a West Atlantic UK 737, and it's just arrived, and it's just actually departed Edinburgh and is heading over to London Stansted. Next we have an EasyJet A319, and he's just arrived, he's just arriving into Glasgow from Faroe. Next up we have a Lufthansa A321, and he's making a flight over to Reykjavik from Munich. Next up we have a Wizz Air A320, which is making a flight from Warsaw to Reykjavik. Next up we have a SAS CRJ 900, it's making a flight to Trondheim from Copenhagen. Next up we have an Air Canada Rouge 767, and we don't know where that's flying to, but he's departed Athens. Next up we have a Qatar Cargo 777, and is making a flight to Chicago from Amsterdam. Next up we have an Iceland Air 757, which is making a flight from Milan to Reykjavik. Next up we have an Iceland Air 737 MAX 8, and is making a flight from Copenhagen to Reykjavik. Next up we have a FedEx MD-11, which is making a flight from London Stansted to Indianapolis. Next up we have a Aerologic 777, which is making a flight from East Midlands to Cincinnati. Next up we have a Transavia 737-800, which is making a flight from Tarasouli to Reykjavik. Next up we have an Aeromexico 787, which is making a flight from Amsterdam to Mexico City. Next up we have a Lufthansa Cargo MD-11, which is making a flight from Frankfurt to Chicago. Next up we have an Cargolux Italia 747-400, which is making a flight from Luxembourg to Chicago. Next up we have a Iceland Air 757, which is just arriving in to Reykjavik from London Heathrow. Next up we have an Air India 777-300, which is making a flight from Newark to Mumbai. Next up we have a Kalita Air 747-400, which is making a flight from Brussels to Cincinnati. Next up we have a UPS 767, which is making a flight from London Stansted to Louisville. Next we have an Emirates Airbus A380 making a flight from Toronto to Dubai. Next we have an Etihad A380, which is making a flight from New York JFK to Abu Dhabi. Next up we have a Al Al 767, which is making a flight from Toronto to Tel Aviv. Next we have a Etihad 777 in the old livery, which is making a flight from Chicago to Abu Dhabi. Following behind him we have an Emirates 777, which is making a flight from Dallas Fort Worth to Dubai. Next up we have a Delta A330, which is making a flight from Amsterdam to Detroit. Next we have a FedEx 777, which is making a flight from Cologne to Memphis. Next we have a WOW Air A321, which is making a flight from Reykjavik to New York JFK. Next up we have a WOW Air A321, which is making a flight from Reykjavik to Detroit. Next up we have a WOW Air A321, which is making a flight from Reykjavik to Cincinnati. Next up we have another Air India 777, which is making a flight from Chicago to Delhi. Next we have a Lot 787, which is making a flight from Warsaw to Chicago. Next up we have an Aeroflot A330, which is making a flight from Moscow to New York JFK. Next up we have a United 777-200, which is making a flight from Newark to Hong Kong. Next up we have an Air France 787-9, which is making a flight from Paris to Montreal, sorry. Next up we have an Air Transat A330, which is making a flight over to Tel Aviv from Montreal. Next up we have a Lufthansa A340, which is making a flight from Mexico City to Munich. Next up we have a Airbridge Cargo 747-400, which is making a flight from Chicago to Moscow. Next up we have a British Airways 787-8 Dreamliner, which is making a flight from London Heathrow to Montreal. Next up we have an Atlas Air 747-400, which is making a flight from Dover to Hanoi. Next up we have a Privilege Style 777, which is making a flight from Rome to Newark. Next up we have a Clitter 747, which is making a flight from Leipzig to Cincinnati. Next up we have a Norwegian 787 Dreamliner, which is making a flight from Copenhagen to New York JFK. Next up we have a British Airways 777-200ER, which is making a flight from London Heathrow to JFK. Next up we have another Emirates 777, which is making a flight from Athens to Newark. Next up we have a United in the Star Alliance livery, and it's a 777-200, which is making a flight from Newark to Tel Aviv. Next up we have an Air Canada Embraer ERJ 190, which is making a flight from St. John's to Ottawa. Next up we have a Delta A330, which is making a flight from Atlanta to Amsterdam. Next up we have a Hainan 787 Dreamliner, which is making a flight from Boston to Beijing. Next up we have a Lot 787 in the Independence livery, which is making a flight from Warsaw to Toronto. Next up we have a KLM 747-400 in the new livery, which is making a flight from Toronto to Amsterdam. Next up we're going to have a United 767, which is making a flight from Washington to Rome. Next we're going to have a TAP Portugal A330-200, which is making a flight from Newark to Lisbon. Next we're going to have an Austrian 767, which is making a flight from Newark to Vienna. Next we're going to have an Icelandair 757, which is making a flight from Reykjavik to Newark. Next we're going to have a Finnair A330, which is making a flight from New York JFK to Helsinki. Next we're going to have a British Airways 787, which is making a flight to New Orleans from London Heathrow. Next we're going to have a Qantas 747, which which is making a flight to not applicable. Next, we're going to have a Delta 767, which is making a flight from Newark to Paris. Next, we're going to have an American Airlines 737-800, which is making a flight from San Diego to New York JFK. Next, we're going to have a British Airways 747, which is making a flight from JFK to London Heathrow. Next, we're going to have a JetBlue A321, which is making a flight from Las Vegas and is arriving into New York JFK. Next, we're going to have a Delta 737-900, which is making a flight from Punta Cana to New York JFK. Next, we're going to have an Air France A380, which has just arrived into New York JFK from Paris Charles de Gaulle. Next, we're going to have an Egypt Air 777, which is going to be making a flight over to Cairo. Next, we have an Aer Lingus A330, which has just arrived into New York from Dublin. Next, we're going to have a Virgin A330, which is going to be making a flight to London Heathrow from... Next, we're going to have a American 777, which is going to be making a flight over to London Heathrow. Next, we're going to have a KLM 787, which is going to be making a flight over to Amsterdam. Next, we have a Norwegian 787, which is going to be making a flight also to Amsterdam. It's lining up for departure as a Delta 767, which is going to be making a flight to Los Angeles. Holding short of the runway is a Delta 767, which is going to be making a flight to San Francisco. Also holding short for departure is on Al Al 787, which is going to be making a flight to Tel Aviv. Just on finals is a Kuwait 777, which is arriving from Shannon, which is quite odd. If any of you know anything about this, leave it in the comments below. Next, we have a UPS 767, which is just turning finals into Newark from Louisville. Next up, we have a Spirit A320, which is making a flight from LaGuardia to Myrtle Beach. Next, we have a Southwest 737-8 with split scimitars. It's making a flight from Newark to Denver. We're going to change the scene now. We're going to go to this area. In particular, we're going to go to this area, which I believe is Japan. We're going to kick this one off with a Vietnam A350, which is making a flight to Tokyo from Ho Chi Minh City. Behind him is a Thai A350, which is making a flight from Bangkok to Tokyo. And in front of them is a Peach A321,
which is making a flight to Tokyo Narita from Ashikawa. In front of them is an Japan Airlines 787, which is making a flight from Bangkok to Tokyo Narita. Behind him is an ANA Cargo 767, which is making a flight to Tokyo Narita from Shanghai. In front of them all is a FedEx 777, which is making a flight to Tokyo Narita from Guangzhou. Next up, we have a Air France 777 making a flight to Narita from Paris. Next up, we have a Singapore 787 on finals into Tokyo Narita from Singapore. Next up is another Vietnam A350, which is just turning finals, I believe, from Hanoi. Next up is a FedEx MD-11, which is going to be arriving in Tokyo Narita from Shanghai. Next up is another Japan Airlines 787, which is arriving from Moscow. Next up is a Cathay Pacific Cargo 7478, which had departed Hong Kong and is going over to Anchorage. Next up is a KLM 777, which is making a flight from Amsterdam to Tokyo Narita. Next up is a Finnair in the Christmas livery A350, which is making a flight over to Tokyo Narita from Helsinki. Next up, we are going to have a Philippines 777 from Vancouver to Manila. We're actually going to go over to Manila, actually. So next up, we have a Philippines A321, which is arriving into Manila from Bacolod City. Next up is a Cebu Pacific A330, which is making a flight over to Tokyo Narita. Next up is a Philippines A320, which is arriving into Manila from Legazpi. Next up is a Philippines A320, which is making a flight from Tacloban to Manila. Next up is a Air China in the pink Penally livery 737-8, which is departed Manila for Beijing. Next up we have a FedEx 757-200, which is making a flight from Guangzhou to Manila. Next up we have a Korean A330, which I believe is heading over to Seoul. Next up we have a Cargo Lux 748, which is heading over to Bangkok from Taipei. Next we have a China Eastern A321, which is making a flight from Cebu to Shanghai. Next we have a Cathay Pacific 777, which is making a flight over to Taipei from Hong Kong. Next, we have a UPS 747-400, which is arriving into Bangkok from Shenzhen. Next up is an Emirates Sky Cargo 777, which is making a flight from Hong Kong to Dubai World Centre. Next up is an SF 767, which is arriving into Shenzhen. Next up is a Hainan 737, which is arriving into Shenzhen. Next, we've already done you. Next up is the Polar Air Cargo 747-400, which is heading over to Hong Kong from Seoul. I'm going to move out of this area now. And I'm going to move over to this little area, which is Hawaii by the looks of things. So next up, we have a China Airlines A350, which is departed Taipei and has arrived into Honolulu. Next up, we have a FedEx Cessna 208B, which is doing a short flight from Honolulu to Lasenia. Next up is a Delta 757, which is making a flight from Los Angeles to Honolulu. Next up is a Hawaiian A330, which is making a flight from San Diego to Honolulu. Next up is an Alaska A321, which is making a flight from Los Angeles to Honolulu. Next up is a Hawaiian 717. Next up is a United 777-200, which is making a flight over to Honolulu from Houston. Next up is a Japan Airlines in the One World livery, and it's a 777-200ER, which has departed to Honolulu for Nagorota. Next up is an Alaska 737 with split scimitars and is heading over to LaHue from Seattle. Next up is another Korean A330, which is making a flight from Honolulu to Tokyo Narita. Next up is a UPS 747-400 from Honolulu to Sydney. Next up is a Korean 777 from Auckland to Seoul. Next up is a Qantas 737 from Auckland to Sydney. Next up is a Cathay Pacific A350 from Hong Kong to Auckland. Next up is a Qantas 737 from Brisbane to Christchurch. Next up is an Emirates A380 from Sydney to Christchurch. Which that's an odd flight as well. Next up is a Malaysian A330 from Kuala Lumpur to Sydney. Next up is another Japan Airlines 787 from Sydney to Tokyo Narita. And the last one to close off this video for today is a China Eastern A330 from Nanjing to Sydney. So if you like this video, guys, please leave a like, comment, subscribe, and also share this video with your friends, your family, and anyone else. And I'm going to leave you with one more aircraft I've just noticed on radar right now, and it's a Singapore Airlines cargo 747 from Auckland to Singapore. And I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.